Welcome to the Common Weal podcast with me, Jonathon Shafi. I'm the campaigns officer here at Common Weal, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Craig Dalzell, who's the head of policy and research at the think tank. Craig, welcome to this week's show. How are you doing?
Hello and welcome back. We're back with a bit of a bang, actually. We have just released a new policy paper that we'll be talking about today. I should say before we start, I do want to pay a little tribute to someone we lost last week. Bill Austin, who was a good friend of Common Weal, a good collaborator. He co-wrote a paper on borders and customs with us in 2017. And he was actually a guest on this podcast about this time last year. It was just about the last podcast we recorded back in the office before the pandemic forced us all into home working. Bill unfortunately passed away last week. He was one of the world's foremost experts in setting up borders and customs arrangements. And he was a great expert when it came to talking about these things, because he wasn't just talking from a theoretical basis when he was discussing these issues. He was talking from the experience of someone who had actually done it, who had consulted with governments in setting up new borders and customs arrangements. He has left a legacy for in that experience for Scotland. His work is there and will serve us well as we move forward towards independence. It's just unfortunate that he won't be there in person to guide us. So I've been thinking about Bill, and my thoughts are with his friends and with his family. But we will continue his efforts to build a modern, independent Scotland with all the infrastructure that we need to run that state.
Well, Craig, it was a tribute that you made there to Bill, and just from my own self as well. Our thoughts are with all of his friends and family at this time. To move on to one of the sort of key issues that has been a long burning discussion in Scottish politics is the council tax. You may remember that the SNP manifesto, over a decade now ago, did say that they would scrap what they termed the unfair council tax, and that of course still hasn't happened. And there have been a variety of campaigns, political parties and organisations who have spent a considerable amount of time putting forward the prospectus that the council tax is unfair and that there are far better systems that we could employ. And there's a fantastic new paper. It was out in the Sunday National. It's on our website, and the link to the report will be put below this podcast. Is that a Common Weal have come up with a really serious plan for replacing the council tax, a property tax that taxes land as well. So we're going to go into some of the detail around this in this episode of the podcast, but as I normally do, Craig, if you could just give our listeners, I suppose, a broad overview of what you see as being the kind of key tenets of this policy.
So the history of this debate around the council tax actually goes a little bit before that tax. It goes back to the poll tax, which anyone who's just even a little older than we are will understand intimately, and even we understand historical connotations of the debates around that tax. When the fight to scrap it was won, it was replaced with something that, in all honesty, was not much better. The council tax. Instead of being a flat tax on every individual, this was levied on your building, on your house, but it was levied in a way that was only marginally more proportional than that tax. The amount paid by the people who own the very biggest and most expensive houses is only slightly more than the people who are in the smallest and cheapest houses. It doesn't really scale the way that, say, income tax scales. Come forward to where we are now in 2020, and the tax looks even more out of date, because the tax is not based on the current value of your property, but what your property was worth in 1991. Or if your building was built after 1991, they do a calculation of what it would have been worth if it had been built in 1991, which is, by any measure, absurd. Imagine your income tax was based on what your notional salary would have been in 1991. So you're right, there has been debates for years, decades now on getting rid of the council tax, but nobody has ever really grasped that thistle and actually done it. And when the SNP won their minority government in 2007 with that manifesto promise to get rid of the council tax, they ended up not being able to get that through the Parliament as a minority government. And everybody who has an interest in this has said they will do something or suggest a replacement for it, and nobody really has in any meaningful way. So this is our contribution to that debate, to try and come up with something that is better, is implementable, and can be done by the next Parliament after they're elected in May. So what we did look at various alternatives. Alternatives like, instead of taxing property, we could have a local income tax that is paid based on your income and paid directly to your local authority, and this has been suggested by, again, several parties. The SNP have suggested it, the Scottish Socialists have suggested something along these lines. We shied away from that because while there are advantages in terms of ability to pay, I'll talk about that in a bit, it doesn't address a bigger problem in Scotland, which is wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is right now higher than income inequality. And if we don't have effective wealth taxes, then we can't address that. If you have a situation where you only have taxes on income, then what you could find is people who already have capital, already can afford to buy multiple properties. Then what will happen is they can buy those properties, flip them, renovate them, or just wait for the price to rise and then sell them on at a profit. That doesn't generate income, it generates capital gains, but it's not being taxed as effectively as income. So with a local income tax, you can't address that problem of the people who already have property continuing to buy more and getting richer that way. So we felt that a property tax is still the way to go on this. Another big weakness of the council tax is it doesn't tax land. So I'm not talking about your garden, which is sometimes how this is decried by those who are against this tax. They call it a garden tax. You were only taxing the house before, now you're taxing the garden as well. That's not true, because if you think about it, if you're selling a house, you generally sell it with the garden. You don't sell the garden off as a separate plot. Now that's not necessarily true if you, for example, have a mansion with a shooting estate up in the hills. You could conceivably sell those off as separate assets, and right now council tax only really covers the manor house. It doesn't really cover that shooting estate. So having a property tax that covers both the land and the buildings that you own, solves that problem, and it solves it in a way that's a bit simpler than other suggestions like a land value tax, which is a separate tax on the land, and you then have to try and work out what is the value of the land detached from the property, what is the value of the land underneath the property, which is possible, and the Scottish Greens advocate this. Andy Whiteman, late of the Scottish Greens, had done a lot of work in trying to do these land value calculations. Even he will admit that they're very complex and they're hard to understand. So, taking all that, we decided that our property tax is a much simpler, much easier way to understand when we apply it. And what we've calculated, what the author of the paper calculated, was that if we have a tax of 0.63% of the current value of your property, then across Scotland that would bring in the same amount of money as the council tax currently does. So anyone out there who owns a property, you can look at what you're currently paying in council tax, and then you could look at what your property is worth. You go onto Zoopla or some other online estate manager that runs these kind of valuation algorithms. You can work out what your property is worth, take 0.63% of that, and then you can work out how much you'd pay in property tax compared to the council tax. So it's a very simple way of working out how this will affect you.
Well, can I just ask you, Craig, because I think our listeners will be very grateful for that detail that you've provided, and I want to ask you some more about the policy. But just before I do that, I think something which a lot of people have asked me when it comes to the council tax, and I'm interested in your view on it. What is it that you think has made the Scottish Government and the SNP so hesitant around scrapping the council tax and putting in place a better alternative? Is it a question of political will, or is it a question of not having a coherent enough alternative? I'm just interested in your kind of view on that.
Well, various reasons are given, from not having a valid alternative to not having the data to work out how they would do the calculations. Both of those are ultimately one of political will as well. If you have the will to change the tax, then you should go and do the maths that you need to do to implement it. Another big issue is the lobby power behind this, because right now there are a good number of houses that are sitting in the wrong band. And the prospect of rebanding these houses and creating quote unquote winners and losers, people who have been historically not paying as much tax as the value of their property would suggest. You can see not wanting to upset these people in election time. This is especially important with the large landowners, who have a very vested interest in not paying any tax, and it's those properties that would be paying substantially more. One case study example we give in the paper is of a manor house and an estate, an 1,100 acre estate surrounding the house. It's currently on the market, and it's currently valued at around £2.4 million. Right now, that manor house is paying about £3,000 a year in council tax. Under our property tax, it would be paying about £15,000 a year for the house plus all the land it owns. So you can maybe see that person, or the person who might want to buy that property, maybe has a vested interest in lobbying hard to not pay that tax.
And I'm just also interested, because I think this is part of the context in which we're all thinking these kinds of issues through. Do you see this as having any relevance to our rebuilding strategy when it comes to the post-COVID landscape, that replacing the council tax has a kind of knock-on effect? The property tax that you're suggesting comes with it a series of positive consequences when it comes to rebuilding more generally from the pandemic.
Absolutely. I mean, this. Some of the issues that you might have with building Green New Deal compliant homes is, what would that home be worth in 1991, given all the technology that you're cramming into it to make it Green New Deal compliant? You might find that house ends up paying a lot more council tax than it would under the property tax. You might also find that one of the big differences with this property tax over the council tax is, right now the council tax is paid by the dweller in a home. So whether it's the homeowner or someone who's renting it, they are personally liable for the tax. Under the property tax, it is the owner of the home. So again, the homeowner if you own your house, or the landlord if you're renting it, who must pay that tax. They are the ones ultimately liable. Now, we do have a scheme there that we do envisage the landlord would pass that tax on to the tenant, either partially or fully, and they would have to do it in a transparent way that would be it would be easy to see if your landlord was overcharging you on the property tax. But the ultimate liability for that tax would be on the landlord, and that might act to discourage landlords from buying up multiple properties, which we know has caused massive pressure on housing stock and has driven rents up as the supply and demand has been squeezed. So, yeah, we can see this as being part of the tool in correcting that market and making it one that is more fit for purpose. It's not the only tool. We also have our schemes like our blueprint for rent controls, as well as our blueprint for building more social houses.
Yes, and I was also interested to read, partly because we have done some considerable work on the issue or around grouse moors, and looking at how that land might be used in a better way, and how we could move to oppose grouse shooting and so on. But there's a specific section of the report about shooting estates, and it talks in some detail about what landowners claim that grouse shooting is in relation to it being a fragile business, and that on the basis of that they would object to these, as it puts it, vast expansive land now incurring tax, as it would do under the property tax proposal outlined in the report. Any comment on that? I'm sure it's something that our listeners will have a particular interest in. It'd be good to get your view on that.
Yeah, well, there's also been reports recently produced by the land lobby that show that Grousemoor grouse shooting, driven grouse shooting specifically, is fundamentally not economically viable. On average, it's a loss-making activity and is only kept afloat either through direct subsidies or via indirect subsidies. So, for example, using the land for other purposes like sheep grazing, and then using the revenue from the sheep and the subsidies on the sheep farming to indirectly subsidise the grouse shooting. So you can imagine placing an extra tax burden on it would force those landowners to consider more economically viable uses for their land. And our paper, Back to Life, has suggested many of these more viable options, from building more renewable energy to rewilding the land.
And again, you can see the kind of progressive impact that the property tax can have. And it does just remind me that so much of our policy work is interlocking, that they all work together as part of this move towards generating a far better economic arrangement, far more democratic, that one that is willing to stand up to the powerful lobby groups. And when you take them in combination, Craig, it starts to form really the basis of what a really transformed Scotland could look like. Surely this is an exciting thing, and we know that the independence movement isn't in the best shape at the present moment. But when you start talking about these ideas, you start talking about what we could be doing in Scotland. I like the last line in the report in particular, where it basically says the time for replacing the council tax is long overdue, but then goes on to say that the Scottish Government shouldn't delay in implementing these recommendations, and there's no reason for them to delay. It's just how do we get them to take it up? Now, I think this has been a particularly popular report. Our social media reflects that, and I've had several conversations with people about it as well. Is that something that you've picked up, Craig, that replacing the council tax really is one of those popular demands, and that this kind of policy that Common Weal's written up can be a big part of the discussion moving forward as a result?
Yeah, I mean, just what you were saying there about the interlinking of these policies. That's, I'm going to say this. I'm the policy nerd in the virtual room here, but I've just mentioned that we've published this one paper on tax, but in the course of discussing it, I've already linked it into how it interacts with another 4 policy papers that we've produced, and I haven't mentioned another 2 or 3 that it also interlinks into things like land reform. We've got a big paper on land reform coming up soon. Things on land value capture, a mechanism for local authorities to be able to buy land cheaply and use that to drive down house prices. We have plans around community development coming up as well. So yeah, this is the wonderful thing about policy development for me. It's not just this policy in isolation. It's how does it fit into that broader landscape, and how does it help create that broader vision that we at Common Weal are trying to push.
Very, very well put, Craig. Yeah. And so I think you were still talking there.
Yeah. So yeah, the popularity of this paper in particular has been impressive. We've had a lot of good feedback about this, and keep it coming. If you've got any suggestions, any comments, any questions, please send them in. We really, really want to hear from you. And the comments have been overwhelmingly positive as well. A lot of people recognise the shortcomings of the council tax, and those who have been a bit worried about the implications. A lot of them have been very accepting of what the paper already says about those. You might be concerned if you are, for example, a young student on a low income renting in an area that is rapidly gentrifying and the property prices going up, and you're not really in control of that. So how do you deal with that? To which we say, well, one, the property tax is almost certainly going to have to include a system of discounts and exemptions for people on low income or in special circumstances, just as the council tax does. But two, this is why we have to interlink it to all those other policies, like the rent controls, to arrest that rise in property value, because for decades that has been the political push in the UK is you if you want to get rich, you buy property and you let it inflate out of control, and you suck rent from people to do while it's happening, and that has to end. We have to have a more rational approach to housing policy that starts from the position that first and foremost your house is a home and it's somewhere to live. It's not a capital portfolio.
And we've also done the work as well, Craig, on how we can build affordable homes as well. So, you're looking at actually creating a society in which people can live in good homes, affordable homes, and that these tax systems that are employed are equitable and just, and actually bring about better returns for the society as a whole. So really, there's a win-win situation here. Common Weal has done so much of the work around some of these really central issues moving forward, and especially as we move, fingers crossed, out of the pandemic and towards a discussion about where things then go. And I suppose that was where I wanted to just ask you a couple of final questions, Craig. We had been doing kind of updates on the pandemic, and we'd been having a conversation between ourselves about where we felt things were going. Things looking a little more positive now, Craig, or are we to await until we have such a positive appraisal and see where things go? We've still got a way to go. What's your thinking about this at the present moment?
I mean, folk who have been listening to me and reading my work over the last year know that I have been intensely critical of the Scottish Government in particular and their strategy in handling COVID. Especially the failure to really expand the testing and the tracing that we need to track the spread of the virus through society, and I've been particularly critical of laxity in the border controls to prevent both the virus entering Scotland but also the virus leaving Scotland. Those concerns still remain to some degree, but I would say that the vaccine rollout, now that we have a vaccine, now that it's starting to go out, the vaccine rollout strategy itself, I've actually been fairly positive about it. It seems to be progressing faster than I anticipated it would. So I've got a fair bit of hope there for the vaccines. The fact that my mum got hers a few weeks ago is very relieving. However, we are still seeing these problems with new strains arising, and some of these strains are very concerning in the way that they could potentially reduce the effectiveness of the vaccines, and we might end up having to go back and give people booster shots, or very worst case scenario, a strain emerges that is immune to the vaccine, and we effectively have to start everything again. So all those controls that we talk about still have to be in place, because we're not safe. No one's safe until everybody's safe, and all those concerns I have are still kind of there. We've seen in the last week or so this new Brazilian variant that has started to appear in Scotland. Seems to have got in just before we brought in the mandatory hotel quarantine that I've been shouting for a year that we should have. Finally got it, but look, comes in just a little bit too late. So we still need to have those controls there. We still need to think about what happens if a new variant of concern does start spreading through the community. So we will see. The big test now will be what happens as the current infection rate drops down a bit further, and there's the pressure to start undoing the lockdown increases, and we start re-emerging. I would hope that we stay the course and we keep things under control. I would hope we don't make the mistakes we made last summer of simply reopening, because last summer the data now very clearly shows that the spread of the virus went exponential again immediately after the lockdown was lifted. There was no gap. There was no, it's sitting at a low level and then it started rising. As soon as we emerged from lockdown, it started rising exponentially again. We cannot make that mistake, or we'll just end up in lockdown again over this summer too.
Well, much food for thought there. We'll have to see how things go. I don't think it's quite nightclubs on the 21st of June, as far as Craig's outline goes there, and I think that's generally speaking the case. We'll have to wait and see how things go. So in the meantime, do stay safe. Take a look at our report on the property tax. It's going to be linked, as I say, below this podcast. We've got some really exciting policy development underway at this time as well, and we look forward to talking to you more about that. And we do encourage you to write in to us here at Common Weal to suggest any topics you would like us to discuss, any questions that you have got on our policy platform. Bear in mind that this podcast was developed as a way to reach people and have a discussion about our policy, because often it can appear to be quite complex, and so this is a way of breaking things down. So if you do have any questions or queries, then please do get in touch and we'll address them here on the Common Weal Policy podcast. With that, stay safe and we'll be back next week.